Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Carr. I'm Assistant Director at the Museum of Work and Culture, and we want to welcome you all to this talk with journalist Patrick White. I would like to extend immediately the apologies of the director of the museum, Anne Conway, who is here with us, but who experienced a power outage as part of our storm front that's moving through Rhode Island. Those of you who are joining us from Rhode Island know that we've had a storm moving through in the past hour or so. And so she is here, she is with us, but her connection is not stable enough for her to be giving these remarks that she wrote. So I will be giving them on her behalf. But again, she extends her apologies. We'd also ask that if you could take a moment in the chat feature to let us know where you're connecting from. We know that we have visitors from all across the United States and Canada here with us tonight, and we would really love to know where you're joining us from. So I will quickly begin by saying that this, I'm so sorry, I'm reading her remarks, catching up. Also in the chat, I'm going to place now a link to the New England Franco route in order for everyone to be able to join that. I'm going to place that after I finish these remarks because I cannot do as many things at once as I'm trying to do. Again, my sincere apologies. I am going to share my screen for a moment with you. For those of you who are not familiar with the Museum of Work and Culture, we just wanted to be able to give you a small peek at what our museum is all about. Okay, so everyone should be able to see my screen right now. So the Museum of Work and Culture opened its doors in 1997, 23 years ago this Saturday. It is housed in an old textile mill building built in 1913. And it's located in the city of Woonsocket within the Blackstone River Valley region in the northern part of the state of Rhode Island. The museum is managed by the Rhode Island Historical Society, and Dr. Morgan Graff, who is our executive director, is here with us this evening. We're very happy to have Morgan here with us. The museum tells the story of the men, women, and children who left their farms in the province of Quebec to find work in the textile cities and towns of the Blackstone Valley at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. The main theme of the museum is La Survivance, a word that for new immigrants meant a fight to preserve their language, their faith, and their culture. The museum takes visitors on a journey starting with our recreated Quebecois farmhouse and explores the lives of immigrants at work, at home, at church, and at school through 9 immersive exhibits. The museum panels are bilingual, and now we are, with the power of virtual worlds, we have started to offer guided museum tours in French on Zoom. And if you are a part of a group, school, or organization that would be interested in that, you can email us directly. And again, I will put that information in the chat in just a moment. So it is now my pleasure to introduce you to Marie-Josée Duquette, Francophone and Academic Affairs Attaché at the Quebec delegation in Boston, who will be introducing our main speaker.
Merci beaucoup, Sarah. Bonsoir, bonsoir à tous, and hello and thank you for being with us to listen to Patrick White. On behalf of the Quebec Government Office in Boston and the delegate Marie-Claude Francoeur, who is with us tonight, I would like to thank Anne Conway for inviting Patrick White and myself. I also take this opportunity to highlight the exceptional work done at the Museum of Work and Culture to promote the heritage of French Canadians. The Quebec government is proud to be a partner with the museum and to support activities through the Fleur de Lys Agreement. It is therefore with great pleasure and also an honor for me to introduce Patrick White. Professor of journalism at the University of Quebec, Montreal, Patrick has also founded the Quebec edition of Huffington Post and managed it from 2011 to 2018. Before, he was chief news editor of Canada's largest news portal, chief news editor at the Quebec City Daily, Le Journal de Québec, Deputy Chief News Editor at the Canadian Press News Agency, as well as Reuters correspondent for 7 years, and field producer for the CTV National News in Quebec City. He has a master's degrees in politics science from Laval University. As you just heard, his biography is impressive, but also he has a passion for history, especially the immigration of French Canadians to United States. Tonight, we are delighted to have him discuss this with us. Patrick, thank you for sharing your time and knowledge with us. The floor is yours.
Alors, bonsoir tout le monde. Good evening, everybody. My name is Patrick. I'm broadcasting live from Montreal, Quebec tonight. And I'm going to share my screen with you to share you this presentation that I was planning to give a couple of months ago in March, a few days after March 13, when COVID-19 did strike across North America and my trip to Rhode Island and Massachusetts was canceled. Tonight's talk, it's about the French-Canadian exodus to the United States that happened between 1840 and 1930. So that lasted about 100 years. You have my name, Patrick White. I'm a journalist. I'm also a professor of journalism at UQAM, l'Université du Québec à Montréal. And I was invited to give this talk in March, which was canceled, but we're going to give you a preview tonight. I was invited by the Centre de la Francophonie des Amériques, the Center for the Francophonie of the Americas, the Quebec delegation in New England, in Boston, and the Museum of Work and Culture Preservation. As our friend Marie-Josée said tonight, I used to work for HuffPost, Quenu.ca, Le Journal de Québec, La Presse Canadienne, which is the national news agency of Canada in French, the Reuters news agency, and CTV News. So I've been a journalist for about 30 years now. I'm a radio guy. I did a lot of TV, and I've been working on the internet since 1992. So it's a very great topic tonight, the exodus of French Canadians, l'exode des Canadiens français vers les États-Unis. We're talking about close to 1 million people, 900,000 people who left Quebec for New England mainly and the US, all of them being Catholics and French-speaking from Quebec. If you look at the US today, we think that about 15 million Americans are of French-Canadian descent, and that the population of Quebec today would be 4 million people more if there would not have been this exodus. So the impact for Quebec is massive, because instead of having a population of 8.6 million people today, Quebec would be close to 13 million people. So pretty much the same size of Ontario. For the US as well, when you think about French Canadians, today it's about 15 million people who can claim French Canadian descent in the US. So that's huge. 2/3 of French Canadians set up in New England. Les 2/3 des Canadiens français se sont installés en Nouvelle-Angleterre sur la côte Est. Et la majorité des immigrants du Canada se voyaient comme des visiteurs temporaires. So the majority of French Canadians going to the US in those days, immigrating to the US, perceived themselves as temporary visitors. It was only a temporary thing, they thought. These small colonies, as they like to call them, Little Canada, Petit Canada, like in Lowell, Massachusetts. So where these French Canadians started to go? Basically Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. And let's look at the map of the US today. That's 2017 data. The most common language spoken at home other than English and Spanish. If you look here, it's French in Maine, in Vermont, and also here, I guess it's probably Massachusetts and Rhode Island, if I'm not wrong. So it gives, and also, as you see here in Louisiana, so French is pretty much still alive as the third language spoken at home, or the second language other than English or Spanish. So that's quite interesting. And the US and North America was pretty much French until a while ago. So a big part of North America was French from 1608, when Quebec City was founded by Samuel de Champlain, to 1763. So the US was mainly a French territory. A lot of people don't know that. France sold the United States to Britain in 1763. and that included the Great Lakes area and the left shore of the Mississippi. A little bit later, Spain ceded Florida to Britain, and the US later on in 1803, they got New Orleans, Louisiana, Western Mississippi from France and Spain. And the US acquired a total of 2.1 million square kilometers at that time in 1803. That's 828,000 square miles. That's quite a superficie when you think about it, a big chunk of land. And Britain took over Canada from France. It was called New France during the Battle of Quebec City in Montreal, the Battle of Quebec City in 1759, the Battle for Montreal in 1760, and Britain took over officially Canada in 1763. So look at Louisiana. That's what we see in the middle here. That's this territory called Louisiana in those days that was ceded, given to the US. So that's quite huge when you think about it. Try to imagine the US without that chunk of country today, or this could be France today, or Canada. So this is quite an impactful change and history that we had between the US and Canada and France and Spain. If you go look at the territory, that's what you see in blue right here. This was Canada, owned by France until 1763. Canada was, you had New France here. This is Ontario. This is Manitoba. This is the Gaspé Peninsula. This is, I think, New Brunswick. And you have Maine here. And you have the upper Louisiana, Illinois country that was called Louisiana and lower Louisiana going up to New Orleans. So this is the French part of North America in those days. You had also Great Britain, which was the east coast of the US, and Spain owned Florida, Mexico, and the southeast of the US. So gives you a little bit of great background about how big was Canada in those days. It really was a huge part of the US. Let's talk a little bit about the importance of French Canadians in the US history, even today. The top American cities which were founded by French Canadians. Most Americans don't know that. The city of Biloxi was founded by Pierre Lemoine d'Iberville. Bourbonnais is named after François Bourbonnais. Davenport, Iowa was founded by Antoine Leclerc. Detroit, Michigan was named and discovered by Cadillac, who was French. Dubuque, named after Julien Dubuque. Huron, founded by Jean-Baptiste Flémont. Juneau, named after Joey Junot. Milwaukee, founded by Solomon Junot. Mobile, Alabama, founded by Pierre Lemoine d'Iberville. New Orleans, founded by Lemoine d'Iberville as well. Portage d'Issy, another great US city, founded by Zénon Trudeau and François Saucier, both French Canadians. Provo, Utah, named for Étienne Provo. Saint Joseph, founded by Joseph Robidoux. St. Paul, first settled by Pierre Parent. And we go on with Joliet, Illinois, named after Louis Joliet. So it's great to see the importance of the funding of the US by French Canadians, and cities like Detroit are really a big pride for us because they were founded by people who are of the same descent as us. So who are the well-known Americans today who have French Canadian descent? Madonna, her parents are from Quebec. Jacques Kerouac, his family was from the Rivière-du-Loup area. They moved to Quebec during the Great Exodus. I think that Jacques Kerouac did not speak English until the age of 6 and is one of the top US writer and one of the most famous French Canadians live in the US, actually in Lowell, Massachusetts, and as well in Florida. The wife of Elvis Presley, Lisa Marie Beaulieu, she's from Quebec, her family is from Quebec, and Ryan Gosling is also from French Canadian descent. He's a Canadian actor, really well known in the US, as you know. So these French Canadians, they really had a profound impact throughout entertainment and history, and obviously writing as well in the case of Jacques Kerouac. So if we want to look at the l'évolution de la démographie of Quebec, Quebec was a pretty large place. As you know, it's 4 times the size of France, even today. Between 1840 and 1860, Quebec had about 105,000 inhabitants. By 1900, I'm sorry, it's the number of people who actually went to the US starting around 1840, the first statistic, I'm sorry. So between 1840 and 1860, about 105,000 French Canadians immigrated to the US. That went up to a level of 573,000 in 1900 and about 750,000 in 1920. And the overall figure that we have is about 900,000 French Canadians who moved to the US. Even around the year 1900, a couple of cities in the US had the majority of French Canadian: Lowell, Manchester, Nashua, Lewiston, Maine, Fall River, Holyoke, Worcester, New Bedford, Lawrence, and Woonsocket. So that's very interesting that in those cities, you had the majority of French Canadian at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, so around 1900. And these were cities that had most French Canadian than the average city in the province of Quebec. So that gives you a sense of the evolution of the exodus between 1840 and about 1930. So in a way, these French Canadians, they were a nation within the nation, a state within the state. It's really one of the biggest events for French Canadian in the 19th century. These French Canadians, they created their own institution across the US. They have their own Catholic churches, their own schools, their own newspapers, Caisse Populaire, Desjardins, their own companies. And also, at the beginning, they really have a minimal contact with the foreign world, with the rest of the world, and with Americans in general. What are the actual causes of this mass exodus to the US? There was no religious persecution in Quebec. There were no major political upheavals in Canada. If you look back at the 18th century, there were a few French Canadians, many of them actually, who supported the cause of the American rebels against Britain. The US government gave them lands in upstate New York, followed by friends and families. From there, they slowly started to populate Lowell, New Bedford, Dartmouth, Cambridge, and Taunton. And other causes that we can see before the actual big push around 1840, there were some political agitation during the rule of Governor Craig in Canada between 1807 and 1811, and some economic difficulties to bring some Quebec families. So that led some families to set up in Vermont in those days. There was also a big rebellion in Quebec, La Rébellion des Patriotes, 1837, 1838 in Lower Canada. Lower Canada is Quebec today. Canada started to exist in 1867 as an actual entity and a country. So that big rebellion of the Patriots forced many defeated so-called Patriots who wanted more autonomy for French Canada and also maybe a country for Quebec. They had to exile themselves to St. Albans, Vermont, Rouse's Point, which is near La Colle, that's in New York, Burlington, Vermont, Alberg, and Swanton. The main cause, it's really the demography. The French Canadian exodus had nothing to do with the taste for adventure. The French Canadian population doubled every 25 years in the 19th century. The birth rate was 50 kids per 1,000 people. We went from 335,000 people in 1815 in Quebec to 600,000 25 years ago, 25 years after. So this huge demographic growth coupled with the lack of good agricultural land, that became a real problem quite soon. And between 1784 and 1844, Quebec's population grew by 400%, 4 times. So what should be the causes in Quebec that actually led to this great exile? Landlords, they were called les seigneurs. They increased taxes and they limited the numbers of lands to sell to profit from the high cost of wood in major demand from Great Britain at the time. Many farmers from the Beauce area near Quebec City, they moved to Maine because of that. There was also the possibilities of getting a job outside Quebec City and Montreal were quite limited. And cities over 1,000 people represented at the time less than 15% of the population. So the population of Quebec was in remote areas, farming land. It was really outside Montreal and Quebec City in the rural areas. So there was also the rise at the time of the exploitation of forests and the wood industry. There are also some causes of this exodus related to agriculture. The modernization of all the agricultural equipment since 1840s led to a lot of job losses. The job that was done by machinery in 4 or 5 days was in the past done in 2 or 3 months by workers, French Canadian workers. So lots of poor people were unemployed and starving, like in Ireland. If I speak about Ireland myself, I have Irish descent. My family came from Kilkenny during the Great Famine. Irish refugees, they came to Canada as well. 625,000 refugees from Ireland arrived in Quebec City between 1830 and 1850 because of the potato famine in Ireland. And today, there are 4.5 million Irish Canadians in Canada. And I think it's a third of people from Quebec who have Irish descent today. And we go back to the 1830s going forward, Quebec got many really bad crops of wheat and potatoes, a lot of starving Irish refugees arriving at the same time. And there was also a lot of things happening in the US at the same moment. The construction of canals, the railways, increased competition towards Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, and Upper Canada, which is Ontario today. So this crisis, and I really think it's a crisis, it had dramatic proportions. Lower revenues for families in Quebec, competition from the West, which was Upper Canada, Ontario, and the US states. Many young adults in Quebec were not able to find lands and get a daily job. People were not able to make ends meet unless all members of the family worked and contributed. That included the woman. So going to work in the States for a few bucks was the only way, among others, to survive. So the only solution, well, the exile for these French Canadians was only temporary. It was the last resort, the only resort because of those difficult years that the industrial sector faced before 1860. There was a big financial crisis in Great Britain in 1837 in the US, multiplied bankruptcies in the business world. There was an economic depression in North America between 1846 and 1850. Canada was affected there. And Great Britain also abolished at that time the preferential tariff for the wheat and the wood coming from Canada. So that created a big pressure on Quebec and those French Canadians living in Quebec. It was also a big economic crisis in 1857. This all impacted dramatically industrial and commercial activities. And a lot of those French Canadians that you can see in the pictures, they were potato farmers. So French Canadians, they were farmers, loaded with debt because of bank loans. They had to buy new equipment. One natural disaster and all is gone in the field. They were vulnerable. Prices went down and suddenly they could not repay their debts. So this is the reality of what happened in the 19th century in Quebec. A lot of their assets were seized by the banks, auctioned, and then the exile to the US. The situation was so bad in Quebec that the Parliament of Lower Canada, which is Quebec today, ordered a committee in 1849 to study the causes of the crisis of massive immigration to the US. It was called an infectious disease starting in 1847 because Canada and Quebec were losing a lot of population. So the reality in the 1950s, thousands of young people were unemployed in Quebec or unable to get lands. People were starving, that they had to give up their way of life and they had to move to the US to survive. And they all hoped to come back to Canada one day. Before 1840, the destinations were the richer families from Quebec. They would go to Illinois, Ohio, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. Vermont and Maine as well, often chosen randomly or by rumors of getting a job. There was no internet in those days. I'm not sure, I don't think they had the phone, so they had the telegraph and the railway was starting. 60% of French Canadians moved to Vermont and Maine by 1840. By 1860, New England was the #1 destination for French Canadians. followed by Vermont, Massachusetts, and Maine. And before 1850, migrants used carts to travel with their furniture, their clothes, food for them and for animals. It was a 3-4 week trip, a tough trip, often with cows as well. So just think to try to put yourself into this mindset today with, 1 hour flight to Boston from Montreal, a 55-minute flight from Quebec City to Newark. This is a different time. It was really a black era for French Canadians. From 1840 to 1860 now, we had the beginning of the railways. It was easier to leave Quebec and Canada. Remarkable US growth, civil industry that started to flourish in the US, cotton, shoes, wool, and new factories everywhere. Cotton was up 74% in terms of workers all over New England. Wool, New England got 62% of workers in Lowell and Lawrence. New England produced at the time 60% of all the shoes of the entire US. And I would not be surprised if Canada was part of those statistics. So the manpower turnover was huge. Salaries were low, but not for French Canadians. So they started to pitch in. And there was also a rapid urbanization of New England in the 1850s and 1860s. There were houses to build everywhere, plans to build, new roads to be built, farmers leaving villages, sewage system and aqueduct to be built, and a lot of construction workers from Quebec fled. They did flood in to do that work. Public works, dams, railways, canals, everything was to be built there. The growth of the cities followed quickly. 1860, 7 people out of 10 lived in cities over 2,500 people. And New England was really the place to be. By 1860, New England surpassed the west of the US as the top destination of French Canadians. Why? It was less expensive. The Catholic Church, which was super strong in Quebec until the late 1960s, the Catholic Church of Quebec was fighting against the exile to the west. They started to twin cities between Quebec and New England. So in 1850, 70% of French Canadians in Southbridge, Massachusetts, for instance, they came from the same village in Quebec. And the city of Salem in Massachusetts is twinned with Rimouski, Quebec. The railway, by 1860, the rail network reached 3,700 miles connected to two junctions in Quebec. It was only $10 to go to the US in 1 or 2 days instead of 3 or 4 weeks before the railway. So just one example here, this picture of French Canadians in North Adams, Massachusetts. You see how beautiful they were in those days and very elegant as well. So how did those French Canadians live? How did they live at first? They were living in small communities, in little Petit Canada, in small quarters, isolated, scattered, embedded with an Anglophone and Protestant population. Migrants were very mobile, going back and forth between Quebec and New England, sending a lot of money back to Quebec to help the family. And part of the families stayed in Quebec as well. And being in the US was seen for French Canadian as a sort of jail sentence, but a temporary jail sentence. People wanted to put some money aside, help the parents back in Quebec, acquire a farm for a son, pay off the loans. And the work was very tough on the farms, the forest sites, the brickworks, the marble plants in New England. Very low salaries. 1847, it was $8 to $15 a month as a worker in a plant in Massachusetts, 12 to $15 a month in Rhode Island, 70 cents a day in Vermont, and a plant like Nashua, 50 cents per hour in 1844. You work in those days 14 hours a day, nothing to do with our 7 hours a day. Lewiston, Maine, the 1850s weaver were paid $4.39 per week, pension fund included. In Lowell, $3.78 per week in most plants for women. The plants were open from 5 a.m. to 7 p.m. with 1 hour of lunch at noon, 13 hours a day. No Christmas, no New Year's Day, only July the 4th was a holiday. So what about this French Canadian migrant? What's the typical French Canadian migrant in those days, in those very tough days between 1840 and 1930? He lived in a very bad apartment, no leisures, few contacts with the Americans, did not speak English. He was the victim of resentment of Americans or racism, perceived as being stealing a job, not integrating within the US melting pot, victim of the content of the Irish Catholic authorities of New England at the time. Basically, the French Canadian was a scapegoat. A xenophobic movement called Know Nothing was also fighting against the Catholic religion in those days. Religion was a major problem for French Canadians who were very, very faithful and were practicing their religion on a daily basis. They used to go at the mass, the church, I would say on a daily basis. The masses were in English in the US when they arrived. These were Protestant masses. That was an issue for them. The different traditions of liturgy from the Irish Catholic churches was not working out for them. They could not get confession or council. The parishes were ran differently than from Quebec. And so many stopped to go to the church or became Protestants. So you have to fit in, really. Many French Canadian, they decided to learn English, and that was quite all right. They stopped using French, afraid of being marginalized. They had a feeling of inferiority. De Dubois, de Lacroix, de Boisvert, they changed their name to the Wood, the Cross, and the Greenwood to stop being ostracized in the US, I'm sorry. There was the necessity as well to communicate with foremen, merchants, the authorities, the doctors, the co-workers. So there was a rapid assimilation over 100 years. Most of them decided to remain in the US. Others they did stick together in tight-knitted communities. A lot of illiterate folks. In those days, education was not compulsory in Quebec. There was a will to recreate the lost country, Le Canada, Le Petit Canada, Little Canada was the name of the quarters. And there was a first French newspaper in Burlington, Vermont in 1839, Le Patriote Canadien. They were patriotic societies from French Canada created in the late 1840s and 1850s. The Saint Jean-Baptiste Society, the Saint Joseph Society, the Quebec bishops, they used to come to New England 3-4 times a year to help. And the first French Canadian parishes were created in 1838. Then we had the War of Secession in the US, 1861 to 65. More immigrants came from Canada, colonization, and a massive immigration from Quebec between 1860 and 1900. Hundreds of French Canadian parishes were created, hundreds of schools, credit unions, societies, newspapers, Petit Canada happening all over the 6 states of New England, and an intense religious life, the dream of survival of the French Canadian race, as it was called in those days. So if we look at the numbers, the French immigration, just for the chunk of 1860 to 1870, 52,000 French Canadian, 1870 to 1880, 65,000, 1880 to 1890, 102,000 people in 10 years. And it continued 1890 to 1900, 106,000. So this is historic, it's exceptional, but it's not unique. 72% of all the people that actually did the exodus from Quebec were entire families. 1 out of 5 were just a few members of the families. And after 1900, some started to come back to Quebec. Population of Quebec in 1851 was 890,000 versus 1.7 million in 1901. The urban population in the 1860s, it was 17% of people living in rural areas. In 1901, it was 40%. So there was a big urbanization of Quebec happening at the time. The agriculture, the way it developed in Quebec as a commercial operation, it started to grow in the 1900s. It was poorly developed one in the 1850s when people really started to go to the US. Dairy farmers started to develop big time in Quebec in the 1870s with a more specialized agriculture. 1867 was a big date as well with the foundation of Canada. And we had the first census for Canada in 1871. So the low agricultural price from 1873 to 1896 could be one of the big explanations for the exodus to the US. The prices were so low that people had to go to the US to bring back money and earn money. The banks are so to blame, not only today, but in those days as well. A 3-month loans, but the farmlands produced once a year. So it was a nonsense, these 3-month loans set up by the banks in Quebec City and Montreal. That greatly contributed to the exodus, the mass exodus, as we shall say. The interest rates were between 8 and 12% in those days, 15 to 20% sometimes, loan sharks, as we call them. There were a few good years between 92 and 1862 and 1867. Then a few bad crops, price went down, everything's going down, all related to the economic cycles and recession. So that was tough for people to come and go between Quebec and New England. And it was a chain reaction. Once you could not pay your loan, the lands were seized, money requested within a few days by the banks, sometimes 48 hours, and the farmers had to leave Quebec. Not enough jobs in Quebec as well is an explanation. The Quebec manufacturing output rose from 2 million in 1851, which is kind of a joke when you think about it, to 154 million in 1901, where Quebec started to produce clothes, food, tobacco, wood, iron, steel, railway plants. There was a big recession that lasted 23 years between 1873 to 1896. So you saw those big numbers at the end of the 19th century of French Canadians going to the US. That's one of the big explanations as well. No social measures in those days, no unemployment insurance, no welfare, no financial help from families, and a spiral of indebtedness. Some families move 20 times in 50 years. Think about it. Salaries in Quebec plants, 60 cents per day in average. And in Maine, it was 150 per day. So it's 3 times more. And the church, the Catholic Church, took care of the poor, but it was not enough for those people. So where did those French Canadians go? Where did they go? Well, by 1900, Massachusetts was number 1, Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Connecticut. That's the big picture of where we had those French Canadians by 1900. The French Canadian worker, what's the average French Canadian worker in those days? Reliable, skilled, dedicated, and docile. The French Canadian does not strike. There were recruiters who were crisscrossing Quebec to bring workers to New England, considered traitors. Advertising in all the newspapers in Quebec, like a fever, is the word of mouth. It was a real word of mouth in those days. The money was coming back to Quebec as well, but the advertising had a big effect on people going to the US. Temporary housing was paid in the US at the time. Transportation to the US was paid in part or fully. The food was paid for the first week, but everything was deducted from the first paydays. So it was not that generous. I spoke a little bit about the War of Secession, 1861 to 65. About 40,000 to 53,000 French Canadians served the armies of the Union of the 23 states. 14,000 French Canadians died during that war, and the family was getting $1,000 at the end of the war. So that's important to remember the service of French Canadian for the US Army in those days. Beginning of the 20th century, 1900 to 1930, about 600,000 French Canadians were living in New England at the time. It was 10% of New England's population, almost 20% of New Hampshire, 13% of Rhode Island, 12% of Vermont, 8% of Maine, but 90% of the Aroostook Valley, 26% of Lowell, a quarter of Burlington, 40% of Manchester, New Hampshire, and 60% of Woonsocket. So that gives you really a big sense, the big picture, the big numbers about those days and those beautiful families. That's the one that came from Montreal to New England. Large families, that's the typical Catholic French Canadian family. 15 to 20 kids per woman was not extraordinary at all. That brought $14 to $15 per week per family, which was a lot. Most of the families had 6 to 10 members, 67% of them. Families of 11 to 15 people, it was close to 16%. And small families, it was a quarter of them. So in some plants, 75% of French Canadians in Lewiston, Maine, for instance, the workers were mainly French Canadian in some of the plants. So that brought social problems as well, bad quality housing for French Canadians, no money to pay the doctors, the kids died early. There was an issue with alcohol as well. In Manchester, there were 250 liquor stores. There were 500 in Lowell, including drugstores. Lots of poverty in that time, in that difficult time. There were 200 priests from French Canada by 1891 and 202 French Canadian parishes in the US by 1909. And there were almost 200 French Canadian daily newspapers in the US at the beginning of the 20th century. So that was a quite powerful French Canadian nation that we see there. And there was a slow assimilation that was unavoidable. The archbishops in the US remained Americans and they tried to impose English. There were also 14 million foreigners that came to the US during that time. A lot of Chinese went to the northern United States. They became American citizens. The French Canadians started to school in English of the new generation. They became Franco-Americans because of all the marriages, and that's quite all right. July the 4th, at some point around the 1930s, was more celebrated than June 24, which is the Saint John the Baptist national holiday in Quebec, la fête de la Saint-Jean-Baptiste. But there was some good stories, some good news. Some of the French Canadians did great work, like Aram Potier, who became the governor of Rhode Island in 1908. And he was close to the US President, Howard Taft. He was also a mayor of Woonsocket. Monseigneur Georges Albert Guertin was the Archbishop of Manchester in 1906. French Canadian senators were all over the place and members of Congress in almost all of New England in those days. Henri Renault, a French Canadian who won the Boston Marathon in 1909. François Ouimet became a US top golf champion at the time. And Napoléon Larry Lajoie was a top baseball player. It's quite interesting to know these French Canadian characters in the US. And we had less and less immigration in the US at some point in the 20th century. You see the numbers there between 19 and 1910. 40,000 came back to Quebec. Between 1910 and 1920, 80,000 went back. 30,000 came back to Quebec. So a much better Quebec economy overall. There was some major growth of the Quebec economy between 1896 and 1920, some kind of euphoria. So some of those French Canadian definitely decided to go back to the province of Quebec, which was part of Canada since 1867. French Canadian left the countryside for bigger urban centers. Montreal was up by 74% of population between 1901 and 1911. That gives you the picture of the time. Only 5% of the kids in factories in New England in 1919. That was down from 14% in 1880. So these kids working in factories, that was a big issue in those days. We need to keep that in mind. And there were less Franco-Americans born in Canada than born in the US in those days. So when you're born in the US, you're American and you don't have the same connection to Quebec and French Canada. So the assimilation was pretty strong in the 1920s. 1913, a quarter of Franco-Americans in Manchester were already totally assimilated. In the 1920s, 130,000 French Canadians moved to New England. A major recession in Quebec in the 1920s. The growth came back in 1925-26, but then we had the 1929 depression. There was a major cut down on foreign immigration in the US in the 1920s, except for French Canadians. And in 1918, that's the beginning of the end in Rhode Island, the law imposing English in public schools in Connecticut, followed by New Hampshire and Rhode Island. So these laws were really tough on French Canadians and the protection of the French language there. Melting pot in the US. The US is a real melting pot because there's one strong language. There were only 43 French Canadian newspapers left in the US in 1912 versus 1925, in 1937. And then we also had the depression, the US economic depression, and in Canada in 1929. So my sources for tonight's talk, if you want to know more about the history of French Canadians, Yves Roby, who wrote a book called Les Franco-Américains de la Nouvelle-Angleterre. Yves Roby wrote that in English as well. It's called The Franco-Americans of New England. Sorry. You have Gérard Brault, who wrote a book called The French Canadian Heritage in New England, and also one of the latest books by David de Vermette, A Distinct Alien Race, the untold story of Franco-Americans. So in conclusion, thank you for listening tonight. I'm just proud to be able to tell you that story. I have no member of my family who actually moved to the US, but this is a moving story. You should be proud of having French Canadian descent. You should be proud of being Americans with great values. The history of Canada and the US is totally intertwined, and I will be very happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Patrick. So we're going to be taking questions in the chat. I'm going to quickly post the link I had mentioned earlier to the New England Franco route for anyone who's interested. I'm posting that now, so you can access that. And if you would like to answer questions or ask questions rather in the chat, you can do so. Again, because of the volume of people here today, right now we still have 228 people connected to us who are here from 21 states and 3 Canadian provinces, which is very exciting. And I will ask, Marie-Josée, would you be willing to read aloud any questions we receive in French?
Sure, yes.
Excellent. Awesome. Okay, great. So you can feel free in the chat to ask questions in English or in French, and we will read them aloud to Patrick.
Yeah.
So I have my first question here. Could you talk about the railway? Where did they get on the railroads in Quebec, and where did they get off?
That's a very good question. I don't have the precise details about that. I know that there was a junction in Quebec City and one in Montreal. From Montreal, it crossed Vermont and New York. From Quebec, it crossed Maine, but the railways in those days are not the same railway routes that we have today. So, but I know that in those days, the railway was going everywhere. The train was going everywhere, unlike today. Even today, it's complicated to take the train from Montreal to New York with Amtrak. In those days, you had direct railway system from Quebec City and Montreal to all of the US and especially all of New England. Even all the small cities that I mentioned tonight, they were all connected by train to and from Quebec City and Montreal.
Excellent. So I just sent Marie-Josée a question in the chat that was in French.
Yes, so les communautés aux États-Unis qui parlent le français. Donc, les États-Unis sont le cimetière des langues non anglais. Y a-t-il des communautés aux États-Unis qui gardent le français comme langue principale?
Peut-être, oui. Ben, il y a beaucoup de gens qui viennent d'Haïti qui parlent français. Les Français qui habitent aux États-Unis continuent à parler français. Il y a quand même beaucoup de gens qui parlent français en Louisiane. Donc, je dirais que les Cajuns de la Louisiane donnent un exemple incroyable avec Zachary Richard, qui est une vedette énorme au Québec et au Canada. Il y a encore beaucoup de gens qui parlent français à Lowell, au Massachusetts. Je suis allé il y a plusieurs années pour le festival Jack Kerouac, qui est vraiment, j'ai été accueilli en français à plusieurs endroits et des gens qui parlaient un français de haute qualité. Il y a encore des gens qui parlent français à Manchester, New Hampshire, à Boston aussi. Mais je pense que c'est beaucoup la communauté haïtienne qui fait vivre le français aux États-Unis aujourd'hui, la Louisiane évidemment, et beaucoup de gens qui viennent de l'Afrique, parce que quand même l'Afrique, c'est 55 pays. Et la francophonie, aujourd'hui, c'est plus de 250 millions de personnes qui parlent français, qui écoutent TV5 ou Radio-Canada ou d'autres chaînes de télévision. Et l'importance de TV5 aujourd'hui et des médias francophones, ça fait toute une différence.
Okay. So we have another question. Did some of the US or New England mill owners dispatch recruiters to Quebec to perhaps compete with other mills and businesses back in the US for certain skilled workers? For example, stonemasons or skilled woodworkers?
Yes, but they were very bright. They hired those people from Quebec because they spoke French and they were very convincing. They spoke the language, Quebec slang, le joual. So that was very useful. They actually hired those people to, talk about the beauties of New England and the money. And, you only go there to make a few big bucks and you come back whenever you want and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, these people were hired locally in Quebec to bring back French Canadian. And yes, there was a huge competition between each city and each industry.
So this is a question that is posed primarily to the Museum of Working Culture, which says, do they or you have any links to where we can get bilingual help for genealogy if we cannot speak, read, or write French? And I will say yes to that question. In Woonsocket, we have the American French Genealogical Society, who are able to help for bilingual genealogy. And I can, at the end, I will put contact information for myself in the chat, and you can contact me and I'll be happy to make that connection for you.
The Facebook groups are also very powerful right now. I see a lot of Facebook groups about French Canadians living in the US. I find them quite interesting. Maybe that the Centre de la Francophonie des Amériques in Quebec City, the Center of the Francophonie of the Americas, they might have some genealogy data for you. Otherwise, maybe on the websites of Statistics Canada and maybe other websites that I don't think of as we speak, but I would think that that could be a first way to start. You have all those genealogy websites, ancestry.ca can give you a proper lineup of your entire families back to 300 years.
Excellent. How good are the records in Quebec for those who left? I know my great-grandfather left the Quebec area, but I'm unsure where to begin the research. From Rhode Island, one side came to Rhode Island, and the other side went to Fall River.
Okay, in Quebec, you have an institution called BANQ, Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec, BANQ.qc.ca. I think they do have all the historical archives of Quebec on that site, BANQ. I will put it there for you. C'est Bibliothèque and Archives Nationales du Québec, and that could be a start to dig in. Otherwise, the Catholic clergy of Quebec, they also have all the birth certificates of all the people who were born in Canada since 1608, and all these records are still available today because of the power of the church, the history of the Catholic Church, and all of that was transferred to the Quebec government in the 1960s during the Quiet Revolution. So that this data should be available at the État Civil du Québec or straight with the local church where your family was born at the time. So these birth certificates are available at the local church or at the Quebec government website.
I have a next question. We went to Canada last year to find our families, but we had a hard time finding old cemeteries. What happened to the cemeteries?
Well, sometimes the land is transferred to somebody else. Sometimes with the years, a road crosses an old cemetery, or the forest starts to bring more trees. So even in Quebec City, you have old cemeteries who have been destroyed by wars, by roads, by urbanization, and also, a lot of trees are all over Quebec now. It's a big province with a lot of forest, and a lot of the cemeteries over the years became run down. Some villages closed as well, and not all the cemeteries were preserved in big cities like Quebec City and Montreal. It's just not possible. The way they actually, build Montreal and Quebec City, which was so small at the time, and Montreal now is 4 million people. Quebec City is close to 1 million now. It's close to 900,000 people. So yeah, the cemeteries are You know, you have the data about it. You could have the map, the location map, but the actual cemeteries, it's possible that they have been forgotten or destroyed over the years because of urbanization.
Why did it take so long for the provincial and national governments to open up lands? Perhaps these lands could have been kept for, sorry, perhaps these lands could have kept more Quebecers in Quebec.
Quebec is too big. Quebec is 4 times the size of France. I would say that 90% of Quebec, even today, is not used by Quebecers because it's so huge. It's the north of Quebec. Not a lot of people live there except Inuits, Indians, Amerindians, native people. So it's a reality of things. Unfortunately, Quebec was so big; there were just forests everywhere and rivers everywhere. It was difficult to actually remove the trees. You have to work hard for colonization, and it was a big problem because the land was just so huge and not enough actual technical capacity to actually eradicate the wood, remove the wood, and build lands. It was a big challenge without enough industrialization at that time, and not enough proper equipment, and not enough money to actually do the job.
Do you know if there are any archives of promoter or recruiter material?
From that time?
Yes, I'm imagining it's the recruiters that had come to the United States. I mean, rather to Canada from the United States.
The names of the top ones are published in the books of Yves Roby, who is the reference. I mentioned the actual 2 books that he wrote in French and in English. So he mentioned the top ones. I would probably think that with the website of the BANQ, Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec, if you try to go in the newspaper section where you go through the archives of Quebec newspapers in those days and the French Franco-American newspapers in those days, you would probably find that in the BINQ website.
Can you talk about the ghost towns that were lost when they flooded the St. Lawrence for the dams?
I'm not sure what is referring to. The dams on the St. Lawrence were, I think, mainly built in the 1960s in Quebec. So I'm not sure how it's related to tonight's talk. Sorry.
So someone is asking me, can this chat content be saved? It can, yes, it will come over with the recording that I did, and I suppose I can try to come up with some way to share a version of it that is in some way anonymized for people not wanting to share their personal information. Okay, it looks like for the most part, everything else I have here is comments. Is there anyone who did not get to ask a question or whose question I missed before we wrap up? Just giving it a moment.
But I see the comment from everybody. It's just a great story to see the pride of those people. They just wanted to make a living. They just wanted to survive. They did survive. They left a great heritage of 15 million Americans who are of French Canadian descent. And even in Quebec today, the fact that it is still a French speaking province 400 years later, it's quite amazing that we were able to protect the French language in a sea of English. If you look at the survival of the French language in North America, how strong the French language is in Quebec right now, stronger than it was 40 years ago, and even 50 years ago, even before when the PQ came to power in 1976. It just shows how strong this language is. And I'm just glad that at least if you don't speak the language in New England or elsewhere in the US, you still remember your history, and the fact that we still remember you as well. And we like the US, we like Americans.
Excellent. We do have 2 more questions. So we have, were the French Canadians involved in the movement to enact labor laws and unions?
Uh, a little bit, yes, because the way the children were abused in some mills and plants. Well, a lot of French Canadian workers were under 14 or even under the age of 10. So it's uh, it's an issue. I know that French Canadians were very docile, very quiet. They were under the radar. They did not want to make a fuss. Pas de chicane dans la cabane, as we say in Quebec. But I guess that in the 1900s, at some point, yes, the labor laws were changed, and French Canadian had a say in this, but they were not the main ones complaining about it.
Can you comment on how the US and Canadian census list the jobs of mill workers?
I don't know how it works. The Canadian census data is always available online, or you can contact directly Statistics Canada, which can provide you content in both languages. As far as the US is concerned, I'm probably sure something is available through data banks in the US via the US Census Service.
I have another question asking if you're familiar with the Quebec Road as far as the immigration of French Canadians to Maine.
I just know that a lot of them left from the Beauce area, which is south of Quebec City, and from the Quebec City area and Rivière-du-Loup. So that's Eastern Quebec. I would say that they probably took the road that is south of Jackman, Maine, where you have the road right now from Quebec City to Jackman, Maine. And from there, there must have been a road or railways that went straight to Lewiston and Bangor. And from Montreal and Three Rivers, you had also railways coming from the eastern townships and Montreal straight to New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Maine as well. And the upstate New York as well.
All right, and our final question for the evening says, my father's family stopped over in Brattleboro, Vermont before coming to Woonsocket. Was this typical?
Could just repeat that, please?
That his family had stopped in Brattleboro, Vermont before continuing on to Woonsocket, Rhode Island, and was that typical?
Very typical. The railway system sometimes stopped. There were junctions in those days. So it was typical to take 1 or 2 or 3 days to go to the US with the railway system. But before that, it was a 3-4 week trip with the cows and the horses. And I just can't imagine that in winter today.
Excellent. And I'm going to very quickly clarify the census question about the jobs. She wrote, I'm speaking of the US Census in terms of how it changed over the decades, both as jobs changed and as census taking practices changed. I can speak to this as someone who just taught a class in the census, which is that if the census asked for an occupation question, you were able to answer it in any way, especially once you get to the late 1800s, early 1900s. There weren't specified categories. You were able to answer that question any way you liked. So to a certain extent, it depended either on the enumerator who was taking the answer, who may have had their own standardized internal system for how they wrote that down, or for the person who was actually answering the question. So it wasn't multiple choice, you just answered.
I see a question about a man named Hébert. So yes, the Hébert family is still everywhere in Quebec, like the Tremblay family. They were a founding family of New France. New France starts in 1608 and ends in 1763. So this was one of the top families, and they settled in the Lac Saint-Jean area, which is 300 kilometers north of Quebec City. Lac Saint-Jean, Lake Saint-John.
Excellent. Okay, well, I want to thank Patrick again so much for being with us this evening, all the way from Quebec. Yes, thank you. And thank all of you for connecting from everywhere. Marie-Josée for her introduction and for always being such a wonderful supporter of the museum. Our executive director, Morgan Greff. And of course, our director, Anne Conway, who I know is still so very disappointed for her power outage and her inability to be here with us today. And if you ever would like to receive more information about the museum or the work we do, please visit our website at rahs.org, which I will place in the chat. And if you would be interested in supporting our museum and the work that we do, you can make a donation at shopmowc.com, which I'm also placing in the chat. Thank you all again so much for being here today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Merci, bonne soirée tout le monde.